Hey, Guru, thank you for coming in. You have an amazing background of accomplishment dating back decades and continuing so. So I appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, Guru, what got you, or maybe let's reword this. I mean, you got this amazing career. I mean, it's outstanding and very unique, very distinguished across so many different domains and so much contribution. What were those three inflection points in your life that made you who are today? And I'm not talking later in your career. It's got to be things that happen when you're 5 or 10, maybe something inside the family, outside the family, perhaps things in school, and then maybe some early career moves as well. Well, so if you can go as early as possible, those things that really help shape you to who you are today.
But thank you. I've not been asked this question before, so this allows me to reflect a little bit. Let's look at a couple of inflection points in my life. And as my career has developed, as my understanding of the world has developed, and they have happened simultaneously, I think systems engineering is the kind of the identity and the background and the presentation and the philosophy with which I identify most. To do that, if we go back even to my upbringing in South India, I was born in an Orthodox Hindu family, and I have a fairly unromantic entry into engineering, akin to an arranged marriage, basically, because everyone around me was studying engineering, so I too fell into it. And it was only years later, through practice and through a broader appreciation of engineering's cultural significance, so to speak, I actually fell in love with it. So it's marriage first, love later. And a couple of early influences I'm happy to share here. First is when I used to be an assistant priest to my grandfather in our village temple. And these early influences and their value can be recognized only decades later, as you like to point out. So I'm happy to reflect here. I used to support him, and we used to open our village temple early in the morning on 5:30 or so, and kind of that early getting up early in the morning. I mean, I still get up 4 in the morning, and maintaining the discipline since that young age has proved to be vital. It's not necessarily an inflection point, but I think over time, through an accumulated practice, it has turned out to be an inflection point because I've been able to create some productive hours up front in the day. So let's just call it as a backdrop inflection. However, some of the professional influences I've gotten were all in engineering school. I studied instrumentation and control systems, so I was trained in the Newtonian paradigm of chasing efficiency and achieving perfection and pursuit for errorlessness, flawlessness, and faultlessness. And a civil engineering professor told me to imagine a system far before it existed. So let's say you're imagining a bridge, you have to feel the load of the columns on your shoulders, so to speak, to get a visceral feel of what exactly you're trying to engineer. So in engineering, there's the concept of a mind's eye, which is mean to imagine a system before its existence, and that allows engineers to bring structure to situations where none exists. So, and I think that was an inflection point to see possible structures, possible patterns, and even possibilities in general on what could be done that is better than the existing scenario. So that's a philosophical take on what's otherwise a very practical point from the realm of engineering. Importantly, another transition happened when I became, or when I transitioned rather, from a Newtonian to a Darwinian. And that happened when I was in grad school. In the United States, when I took a fluke anthropology course with an evolutionary biologist, David Sloan Wilson, and all the standard engineering courses were so popular, they were all sold out. So I had to take something to fulfill a requirement. So I ended up taking an anthropology course while I was pursuing a PhD in engineering and an MBA. And that allowed me to bring in the evolutionary framework. How do you understand, quote unquote, design from Mother Nature's perspective? And I know that's a very provocative word for some evolutionary biologists, because Mother Nature doesn't really brute force design like engineers do. But still, there are aspects of um, the work that Mother Nature has done over billions of years that could be particularly valuable to the way we think about it. Of course, in engineering, we run our work based on schedule, technical requirements, cost, and so forth. Mother Nature doesn't quite have those requirements. So how do you incorporate that kind of open-ended, open-minded sensibility into the heavily, deeply constrained engineering practices is something was a key influence in me becoming a broader thinker and a broader practitioner of engineering as it relates to culture and society. So those are some of the three examples that I can share.
So let's go back again. I mean, as you were a young person, and this is in India, right?
Correct.
And were you speaking the native languages then, or were you learning English at that time? What was your sort of the nature of your linguistic skills at that time?
Yeah, so like many Indians, I know multiple languages, but five of them, and I can recite in Sanskrit and also comfortable in Hindi, Tamil, and Kannada, and a couple other languages I can just pick up and function, basically. So Tamil and Sanskrit are two of the most complicated, two of the oldest languages in humanity, and I think getting an upfront start on that could have helped my interests in getting engaged with complex systems at once. And as I've grown in India, and I've lived in the United States for a couple decades, I go about translating the concepts, and now I've reached a blur. I don't know what language I think in, and what language is conducive for certain forms of thinking, whether if it is an artistic or poetic form of this. Of course, the Indian languages are more helpful to me than let's say the rational way of approaching, in which English becomes the dominant theme and the frame for my analysis.
Yeah, in fact, maybe Tamil's even older than Sanskrit, isn't it? Even predates Sanskrit. And those are very complex, difficult languages, but it gives you access to a lot of ancient knowledge as well, right?
Yes, and that kind of takes me back to my upbringing, and my grandfather had a particularly important influence on me, whose value I recognized only years after he passed away, but 5 years ago at the age of 97. And I've been grateful to him in his absence now, because some of the engineering concepts fusing themselves with the religious concepts as we took care of our temple. So when I was a kid, my grandfather would renovate the temple at a periodic basis, and I was part of it at least once or twice in this. So we had a temple for Vishnu, the maintainer in the trinity of the Hindu gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And so the temple of Vishnu, and he would he would sit on his vehicle, which happens to be the eagle, another god. So Vishnu sitting on an eagle and go around the village. And the entire village would contribute to the renovation of the temple. So there is this social capital involved in this. But I think the act of renovating is, again, engineering in this regard. So my interest in the philosophy and the policies for maintenance over years, and how we as society needs to prioritize, can be actually tracked back to my earliest years. And that's where your idea of bringing the linguistic approach to characterize such rituals. We have the we have a term called jirnodhara in Sanskrit. Jirna means digesting. Udhara means advancing. So you digest and advance, much like how your body adapts to the various realities in which. So here, however, we're taking care of a temple, and the biological metaphor from Sanskrit. And of course, there are concepts in Tamil as well that fuel in. So there's something about language, spirituality, and engineering that has some deep connection that we have forgotten to increasingly explore in recent years. And that's why some of my favorite places to go whenever I go to India are temples that are thousands of years old and what led to them. So at that, if you look at the way I was trained as an engineer and the way I look at engineering systems now, it's quite different because these are not just structures, but they served a purpose beyond, let's say, the hardware. I think it was a pulling together of community, whether it is for political ambitions, religious reasons, and so forth. So engineering in this, viewed this way, is a far ancient act of know-how than the sciences of know what. So we were all engineers way before, as an original cultural choice, even before science and the practices and the methods for science even evolved. That's how I've grown to see engineering as I get older.
Okay, so you're a very young man. You're 5 and 6, and you have this capacity for different languages, and including some of the most difficult languages, which gives you access to all of this ancient knowledge and this intertwining between humanity and knowledge and spirituality and systems thinking, and you're recapturing that. But and so in your and you're helping this family member from a priest standpoint, right? And that would awaken you from a broader perspective, again, this kind of systems thinking. So at what age did you say to yourself, I want to be an engineer? I mean, what triggered that desire? Was it family, or you just kind of self-initiated this sort of tendency towards, I want to understand how things work. I want to understand, I want to also study the underpinnings to become an engineer, the mathematics, the physics and chemistry and so on, because initially as an engineer, you study everything. Mm-hmm. You specialize. So what triggered your interest in that aspect, and how early was it?
I would say maybe after 10th grade, my interest got more serious. So maybe between 5th grade and 10th grade, I was just interested in exploring a range of things. I wasn't even particularly good in math in middle school, and I think I became better with the practice when I got to the high school level competition. And of course, studying in India and some of the schools that I studied in, it's intense. And so my interest in physics and chemistry were enormous. I did very well in biology at the high school level, but of course, I think I departed from there and I picked up computer science as a mode to help me prepare for engineering. But I think the biology would come back to bite me in a way. When I did extremely well in my undergraduate degree, and I got one of the top ranks in the state for biomedical instrumentation and everything. But I think I needed to get a deeper understanding of biology when I came to the United States to pursue a PhD in biomedical engineering, and which means the last time at that point I had taken formal biology was 10th grade. And the people in my class, they were all like MD, PhD students with like years of knowledge and practice. And I was basically failing the first half of the semester in the first year of my presence in this country. And the TA basically gave up on me, thinking that maybe you need to start memorizing this stuff to pass this course and so forth. Then the second half of the course contained electrophysiology, so balancing the equations came up and everything. And I think I kind of got back up to speed, and the professor was kind enough to curve everyone up. And so that's how I escaped the tragedy, potentially. But then it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was the evolutionary perspective that I think took me away from the standard reductionist tendencies to this. I think I was young enough not to understand, the value and the limits of reductionist thinking and the value and the limits of more comprehensive systems thinking at this stage. But I think it comes to the bigger question: can you teach systems thinking, or does one gain only in practice? And that's a question we need to confront. I mean, I think as educators, as practitioners, and we don't have a clear answer to that yet.
So let's mind this then. So you at the 10th grade, you start realizing that you want to get into sort of the practical aspects beyond the curiosity across a broader range of kind of science-related areas and other areas, languages also, and you get this taste of biology, but you end up getting into the kind of a systems engineering thinking. You get your master's and your PhD in biomedical engineering and MBA also. And then what was your first job?
So I went through a number of professional experiences even while I was studying. So call me a junior engineer or a project engineer. So I went through 6 different experiences. I worked for a fertilizer factory, worked in a power plant, and I worked at a transducer company, and then a candy factory, believe it or not, which was one of my favorite and sweet experience, literally. And then eventually I found myself in a hospital when I had the first exposure to imaging. It was a brand new MRI scanner that was brought into and established in a hospital, and it was just a month or 2 old, and a kid was getting scanned for a brain injury, and I sat next to the imaging engineer and how the doctors were talking about it, and I had a kind of a inspired moment there about getting involved in radiology. So that really got me interested in it, and that spiked my interest in specifically biomedical instrumentation. So I had some early industry experiences even while I was studying, and so that was extremely helpful. After my master's, I found a job, selected to work for a startup company in the Bay Area, and it was a profound experience for me. It's a small company, 4 people in an R&D team, and we were in a very dynamic market, trying to establish approaches to treat atrial fibrillation, which is the quivering of the upper chambers of the heart. And if you don't control it, treat it, you get some bad consequences like stroke and so forth. And it affects a lot of people in the United States. It can be pharmaceutically treated, but I think the market that we were in was like, how do you minimally invasively approach this? Because the prior approach was to like cut open the chest, and the surgeon basically cuts and sews the tissues, and you create what's called a conduction block. So you're basically creating an insulation to prevent these bad rhythms to float across the cardiac tissues. And what can we do to make it better? And that's the standard engineering approach here. Okay, we know this, we don't know this. Okay, now what can we know a little bit more about what we don't know? And then try to make progress there. But then you have many different platforms. We specifically exploited microwave energy, much like baking a potato, we were baking cardiac tissues. And as someone with my background and a priestly background, I'm a lifetime vegetarian, and I was doing animal experiments to the point that my colleagues started calling me a vegetarian butcher, and to get some understanding of what it is. But I think there was also another influential moment there, because I was involved in a surgery with a surgeon in Northern California, and someone's heart just stopped during the surgery. And I'm in my 20s, and I'm trying to understand the meaning between life and death. And as I'm trying to navigate into, let's say, more serious adulthood, I think that really kind of forced me to think hard. Now, how do I prevent these conditions from happening before? So microwave ablation techniques really became handy when surgical robots, the Da Vinci robotic system, came in. And I think the procedures that would have normally taken 4 or 5 hours are brought down to an hour, hour and a half, and with very minimal side effects after the fact. And the competition with the other modalities like radio frequency, laser, ultrasound, cryo, and so forth, really fascinating market. And then that company got acquired by another company, mid-sized company, and that eventually became part of Boston Scientific. So those are excellent span of experience that I got. But then I came back to finish my dissertation in New York. And my entire lab moved from Long Island to upstate New York, to Binghamton, New York. And the difference there was, even though I easily transferred on there was no medical school in upstate New York in the program that I was involved in, whereas at Long Island we did. What instead they had was a nursing school, which gave a very different perspective or a horizon to think about care and what it means to, let's say, engineer a system. You don't build a bridge for a weekend or 3 weeks, but build it over 30 years, and how do you robustly maintain it? And I think that contained a far practical philosophy than, let's say, going through the surgical load that people encounter. So you can see there was a phase 1 bioengineer leading to a phase 2 bioengineer in me, and one was heavily physics driven, and the other one was more formally biology driven. So there was that approach. And I've been involved, I was involved also in consulting for companies in improving lower limb blood circulation through neuromuscular stimulation and so forth. So I've maintained my touch with the industry throughout. After I finished my PhD, I was selected, again, very accidentally, for an economic policy fellowship in Washington, D.C. at the National Academy of Sciences, which is my intellectual home 15 years after. And that has given me the platform to conduct technical work on vaccine development. And I was fortunate to run a program for about 8 years during Ebola and Zika crises, and I stopped that work just basically a year and a half, 2 years before COVID happened. And then I also did work on prescription drug pricing. So that's a heavily political subject, at least in the United States. So my professional work has basically triangulated devices, drugs, and vaccines, so largely medical products segment. And for the past now approaching 6 years, I've had a leadership role in the National Academy of Engineering, looking at how do you incorporate engineering and technology insights as advice to the federal government, and also develop internationally relevant approaches to think about systems engineering possibilities for issues like how do you deliver on large engineering projects and mega projects, and how do you think about peace building, and how do you think about food and engineering, food and agricultural systems. So my horizon has significantly broadened over the past decade, but engineering remains the root.
There's so much here. I mean, you're pursuing your degree and your advanced degrees. You end up working with a startup, and the startup is working in sort of this area of surgical catheters for cardiac ablation. And you talked about microwaves, and then you get into neuromuscular stimulators for improving blood circulation. So you have this kind of direct application of engineering. And then you get into the vaccine and drug aspect, or just like the biological aspect of engineering in a very practical sense. But then you also get into kind of the economic side of it. And I would say even some of the policy sides. And this comes now as director of programs of the National Academy of Engineering, which would look at kind of holistic solutions and ways to apply engineering principles or systems thinking to broader ecosystems or broader platforms like the federal government, or like you said, maybe this is adaptable to bring peace in some way, using engineering principles to bring peace. If you can talk to other engineering societies, it really crosses so many different um, disciplines. And I can see how now this maps to your degrees you have, but you have an MBA as well. And then, of course, you got into this very interdisciplinary thinking because of your childhood and the Indian culture and Tamil and Sanskrit.
Exactly. I'm so glad you picked it up because that's something that I have very less conversations about. Maybe my early exposure to these very complex languages, which is exactly what I do in whatever meeting I go to. I'm constantly translating, interpreting them in many different languages that I was kind of, I grew up in.
Yeah. I mean, and so I can see this now reflected in things like the awards you win. Like you got awarded the Edward Weisband Distinguished Alumni Award for Public Service of Contribution to Public Affairs. I can see how that weaves in. You got the IEEE Norbert Wiener Award for Social Professional Responsibility, again, because of this interweaving, right? You got this Henry Lawrence Grant Medal for Business Leadership because you have this business element in there. You have this Lockman Greatbach Award for Contribution to Health Technologies because you're doing that. The Alfred Goldsmith Award, Outstanding Achievement in Engineering Communication because you're actually bringing communities along and you have to communicate the kind of work you're doing. You have the IEEE USA Award for Distinguished Literary Contribution furthering public understanding for the advancement of the engineering profession because you've written books like Applied Minds, How Engineers Think, and Wicked Problems, How to Engineer in a Better World. So you're communicating and you're speaking on all of this kind of intersection. You're kind of like the poster child of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary thinking. And you're a companion of the Aeronautical Society. Where does that fit? The companion of the Royal Aeronautical Society. And I could see the member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts because you bridge everything. But how does the Royal Academy or Royal Aeronautical Society fit into all of this?
Now, that was a stunning shock and honor because my latest book, Wicked Problems, How to Engineer a Better World, features in a parallel track a protagonist who revolutionized aviation. And my interests increasingly are also like, I wanted to pick up a subject I knew nothing about because most people read books on subjects they know something about. So here I picked up something entirely new, and it's a book dedicated to Binghamton. And the protagonist is from the Binghamton, Ed Link. And he pioneered the very first flight trainer, what in our modern parlance we call it flight simulator. And he issued specialties, and we were talking about interdisciplinarity earlier, and EdLink is, I think, a mega poster child of disregarding disciplinary thinking and really coming up with some core competencies that allow people to cut through complex systems here. EdLink was very interested in aviation as a kid, but his family discouraged his interests and learning how to fly. And we're talking about now 1920s, basically a century ago, was a very expensive endeavor and a very costly endeavor, even life and limb as well, because how do you, they used to charge hundreds of dollars, which transferred thousands of dollars here. It is an expensive hobby. But then EdLink was inspired to, working in the piano factory that his dad ran, and gets the idea for using the suction mechanisms, but that was widely applied in player pianos and theater organs and so forth that the EdLink worked on directly. But to use that phenomena to provide a feel for how you go for an airplane without leaving the ground, and so it's risk-free, yet you get the same experience of flying an airplane. That's how that technology enabled the training of cadets of U.S. and British armies and then the World War II's collective cost of it can only be imagined. Without flight trainers, even the original moonshot in the 1960s, and without flight simulators, we can't even think of the global cultural connectivity, even with the level of aviation traffic and expectation to perform reliably come up. So that's why in aviation, when something goes wrong, it's punished heavily because it's a very unforgiving business. So that's why training training for it is, I think, as important as anything. Anyone can, or let me put it this way, making 10,000 aircrafts is a very different endeavor than making 10,000 qualified pilots to operate them. And that kind of gets us to, why education is such a tough business in society. So Wright brothers duly get all the recognition for showing us how to fly. But EdLink pivotally told us how to train to fly, which is as important as the act of flight itself. So that's why I got very interested in EdLink's story, and I think it got recognized by the Aeronautical Society for that. And the more and more I talk about it, EdLink is such an unrecognized figure in this world. Yet, without him, we wouldn't be where we are with modern aviation and surrounding commerce.
This kind of reminds me, there's these kind of fundamental principles of life and it's sort of the root of innovation and successful innovation. And that's constantly asking questions, running experiments on the edge, kind of at the boundaries, because that's how you stretch. So stretch goals encompassing within the questioning and running experiments. And then observing different circumstances from different diverse points of view, and again looking at the boundaries of these across many disciplines. And then part of that is combinatorial thinking. In other words, you see bits pieces here on the left side, in the middle, the right side, and you look at how do they relate to each other? Can I combine them in novel ways? And that's what you're illustrating. All of this kind of combinatorial thinking. So question, observing, experiment, associating, and forming relationships in novel ways, and combinatorial thinking, which is what your whole background is about. And so that's evidence here in this story. Now, you written this book, Applied Minds, How Engineers Think. So how do they think?
Well, I mean, I could even call how engineers should think, but that won't go too well. But it comes down to the theme, which I posited as modular systems thinking, understanding the world in pieces and in combination, which you had beautifully alluded to. But the three attributes that drive that kind of, gravity toward understanding or engaging with the world are, first, seeing, it's bringing structure where there's none. And second is the ability to design under constraints, which, without constraints, one can even argue there is no engineering. And third is the ability to prudently make trade-offs. In life, you can't have everything. And I think that is more saliently realized in the act, in the practice, in the responsibility, in the accountability of engineering. And I think that's why we are so practical creatures.
Yeah.
Sure, there's the value of idealism in engineering, but still, ultimately, the damn thing has to fly at the end of the day, reliably and safely. And these are not just technically constructed requirements. These are socially mandated expectations. And in that regard, I think that's why engineering is peer-reviewed by reality. And as I said, it is, I think, one of our oldest cultural choices. And I think that's where I'm increasingly trying to find myself. I find myself in situations where there's this duty to articulate this important element that's kind of engineering forms a society and society shapes engineering. So it is such a synergy here. it's unavoidable, unignorable.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a delicate balance, though, right? Being sort of governed by constraints and yet not letting that fetter innovation. I'm just thinking of Elon Musk, right? I mean, he innovates in an unconstrained way, and yet there are constraints, but he does it in a way where it goes out the boundaries of what normal people would typical engineers would think is possible. And then people go, wow, he did that. He got that giant spacecraft to be grabbed by these pincers. And I mean, he's constantly innovating in a way that are at the boundaries of constraints, right? So, I mean,
You're right. I mean, I think how do you build that bridge between your cognition to culture, or in this case, cosmos, rather? I mean, like, so it's very interesting. I mean, in my first book, I think I talk about how you work backward from an ideal design. You imagine this vast prairie of possibilities, and then you add constraints after constraints after constraints. Then you come down to, like, basically a block on Fifth Avenue in New York. And that's a very different set of constraints from there to here. And that happens in your mind. And that goes back to the concept of the mind's eye, what an engineer sees it. How do you feel that stresses and strains on your shoulders for the bridge that doesn't exist yet? And then you work backward. And worse, how do you, after the bridge is built, how do you do continual environmental reviews, upgrades, upkeeps, and everything while the traffic is running? And in one of my recent pieces, I talked about the re-engineering of this bridge in New York, the Bayonne Bridge, and how, when it was first built in the 1930s by Othmar Ammann, the legendary engineer who built multiple bridges in New York City that we now know, well, including George Washington and Verrazano Bridge. So this Bayonne Bridge was built under budget, under schedule in the 1930s. There were no seismic requirements even back then. And now they try to modify the bridge because the bridge's vertical height was not conducive to the ships that were bigger. So especially with the widening of the Panama Canal, you got bigger ships coming to the New York region, and some of the bridges need to be retrofitted so that they could go through. So they needed to raise the bridge by several feet, and they had multiple options. One was to either like build a tunnel, get rid of the bridge, build a tunnel, and that would cost billions of dollars over some years. The second one was to, like, maybe come up with a hybrid bridge, maybe use this, then create a cable stayed model and so forth. And the bridge wouldn't look beautiful. It was going to be awkward looking, but still would serve the purpose. And the third was like, people thought, maybe why don't we build another roadway near the apex of the bridge, kind of thing. So now you're building a bridge within a bridge while keeping it open to traffic. Now, this is what modern life engineering is, because we are so constrained here. And someone actually compared it to conducting open heart surgery on a running patient, with all the cranes and the staging operations and everything, and of course with the reduced impact on local resident life. And lo and behold, there were some rare birds that came a couple of times a year for nesting under the bridge. So the environmental review alone takes 5 years, millions of dollars, and has to involve stakeholder consultation with like 300 different groups, and has to go through special reviews and everything. This is modern day engineering. Like when we go on a highway, or when we go on somewhere and we are complaining about orange cones on this thing, oh my God, there's so much traffic. I hate going on this road and everything. That's engineering trying to improve our quality of life in their own way. So that's how deeply constrained we are. I call them, unlike the grand challenges, which kind of push us to the frontiers of innovation, these are the grind challenges, which are the kind of the mundane, frustrating acts of bureaucracy and care work, standards work, and everything that people don't pay attention to. But that's as important as others. Most of the engineers, but 70% of engineers are actually involved in operations and maintenance, such as the acts that I just talked about. Very minority of engineers are involved in innovation, the kind of the disruptive work that we frequently associate engineering with. Both are important, of course, but one gets more credit and more spotlight than the other. One is sexy, the other is vexy. So now the question is, how do you think about what is the politics of recognition, even the identity, this tension between visibility and invisibility that drives engineering? Is something we need to think about. And how do we bring people into engineering, and how do we communicate engineering? And with the increasing emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, are we maybe excluding people from engineering if we just emphasize one act over another, which might be more fruitful, more supportive of the civilization that we live in?
So we're running to the last few minutes of our interview, but I want to tackle maybe 3 or 4 additional topics. One of which is wicked problems, how to engineer a better world. Can you describe some concepts in there, or how to engineer a better world? So that's one question. And then I'd like to get into, you're the founding director of the Forum of Complex Unified Systems, or FOCUS. So what are your goals? And can you give me maybe an example with an area? And then the kind of the sort of third part is, you served as technical advisor to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the European Union Malaria Fund. So where does that connect? And then, of course, so there could be too many questions in your remaining minutes. And the other one is your final recommendation to the audience, enter questions through the audience. But first of all, Wicked Problems, your book, right? How to Engineer a Better World. Can you give some insights from that book?
Sure. Let me reverse the order, Stephen, if that's okay with you, because I think let's start with the HHS and the European Commission. And this was an opportunity that I got, represented the National Academies for my work on vaccine development. So my work was primarily funded by the Department of Health and Human Services of the United States, and we created a systems analysis platform to prioritize new vaccines for development instead of telling what the government should be prioritizing in a rank-ordered list, which gets quickly outdated. And we saw that, especially during Ebola crisis, when we had actually vaccine candidates for Ebola, but they were shelved for commercial reasons, low profitability, low incidence. But then when the epidemic started in Africa, it created a global commotion around that subject, and then we didn't have viable vaccine candidates at that point. So how do you prioritize those things is something important. So I helped the government and eventually the European Commission to look at malaria candidates using a systems analytic approach. In one case, we developed a software system for it. That was eventually field tested in multiple countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. And the Malaria Fund work cut through the COVID crisis as well. So there were potential candidates looking at combination malaria, Ebola vaccines, and so forth, but they were unsuccessful at that time. But because we didn't fully understand COVID at that time, so that's the gist there. The second is, let's say, the Forum on Complex Unifiable Systems, which is a program that we created at the National Academy of Engineering, where I'm responsible for all the programs. Our programs are guided, again, going back to how we started the conversation, by 3 basic themes: people, systems, and culture. And there's a parallel to that. It's the basic idea there is engineering for people, systems, and culture alone isn't sufficient. You got to focus on the people, systems, and culture of engineering. How do you make the profession itself more welcoming to the widest range of philosophies, perspectives, and participants? So the systems theme directly connects with the FOCUS program, which I've led, and it uses systems engineering as the kind of the base to begin exploring the adjacent possibilities of what it is. I mean, there are hundreds of ways my colleagues do cost-benefit analysis. This is cost-benefit analysis. You put $1 in the numerator and you put a benefit measure in the denominator. Out comes a number to rank something, whatever. That's being done in many different ways. Even for a ratio, we don't have a common approach in our complex world. So how do you think about the many interconnections that we are subjected to and that affect our performance? So this program is very open-minded in terms of taking on these big problem sets and try to bring in the systems engineering attributes to better guide our discussions. And it is discipline agnostic. We have had forums with philosophers to people who study failures in education, to refineries and so forth. So very broad minded program. That, of course, ties in closely with my book itself. And I think one forms and informs the other, so to speak, here. And as you can see, the systems engineering theme deeply linking each of these works. So my latest work, and I talked about Ed Link, who is the protagonist in the one track. So his life is used as an archetype to elaborate on what wickedness means when it comes to engaging with problem sets. It begins with the problem. Engineers love to call themselves as problem solvers. That's where the trouble begins. And I'm very proud of that fact, and I was indoctrinated that very way. But that's where the trouble begins, because we cannot run around and say that we can solve wicked problems, which means you're only dealing with an aspect of the problem. A wicked problem, much like a nested doll, is composed of what you call a hard problem, which are bounded and boundable, and they can actually succumb to solutions. We have a number of things. If you use a QR code to order tacos, or you're checked into a plane using your phone, those are all hard problems with solutions. You have then soft problems, and soft is just in the name. They're actually harder problems than the hard problems, because making a car is a hard problem, but managing traffic is a soft problem. And that brings together a whole range of issues, including economics like congestion pricing. I mean, it's only effective if people can afford it. I mean, there are bridges in New York that charge $25 each way, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, that is. Some people can afford it, many cannot, which means you have to deal with a different type of problem set and everything. So the problem really becomes something else. So that's a soft problem, and you cannot really solve it. You can only resolve it, which means you don't have a perfect situation for it. You can only take it to a good enough situation. The third problem is a messy problem, where our value sets, our deeply held ideologies, convictions, beliefs play a major role in it. We were talking about Ebola earlier, and the example that I like to use here is like during the epidemic, we neglected the early stages of the epidemic, that is, we neglected the role of cultural practices in the spread of the epidemic, specifically burial rituals. People touched the deceased, they kissed, they bathed them and everything, not realizing that was a source of transmission. And so you couldn't just go into a community with deeply held religious practices and tell them not to do. So how do you then create a more dignified ritual that's acceptable by the community? That goes beyond tech. I mean, so how do you reframe the problem out of existence so that the local community actually sees the value in it? And that's the area where engineers are, I think, least experienced in at this point, and we have much more work to do. So unlike a hard problem that can be solved, unlike a soft problem that can be resolved, a messy problem can only be dissolved, which means you have to transform it into a different manageable state. A wicked problem emerges when the hard and the soft and the messy interact. They conspire to produce something different, which means you have to solve, resolve, and dissolve simultaneously. And we don't have that experience, and it has to be trained, much like how pilots got the experience in a flight trainer. There are a lot of things that they can control, but Mother Nature has a mind of its own. So this allows one to fly under conditions where the terms are set by nature. So this allows us to engage with the problems in their terms, not ours. So, and I think how do you take that more generative approach is the substance of my book.
It's fascinating in the world that's messy and wicked.
Increasing. And you had asked me to share maybe a thought for the listeners here. There's a word that has to really.
So it could be a final recommendation and or question to the.
Sure. Okay. Let's offer a suggestion then. I mean, there's a word that has really been in my mind, and that relates to our cultural pressure, commercial pressure to pursue a single action item to implement. This is something that we're all, there's some, the kind of the push to come down to a single action item. The word that's related to this monocausal which is our addiction for single point explanations for everything. And how do you overcome that addiction while managing the side effects is something we need to keep in mind.
That's a good thought for the audience. You know, Guru, I really enjoyed this really far-reaching interdisciplinary discussion where you clearly are a master across many different areas and continuing to grow because you're part of this universe, which is always so dynamic and you're always so changing. So thank you for coming in and sharing so much of your wisdom with my audience.
Stephen, thank you very, very much. It was a joy.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.